Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. This feels like a home crowd to me. I am both a researcher and a practitioner. I know we have mixes of both and people who embody both, but there's so few of these forums that we get. And so I hope we can take advantage of the whole day together. I have to give a little bit of plug for a journal from ACM. If you haven't heard about it, ACM DTRAP, Digital Threats Research and Practice, is another outlet where researchers and practitioners come together to share information. It is a journal, it is slow, but it is one of the few other forums. I thought I just had to bring your attention to that. I am trained as a computer scientist. My PhD is in computer science. I can tell you quite a bit about how this computer works. I never took psychology. I never took economics. I never took sociology. And this is a crying shame. I'm going to use my podiums as much as I get them to try and get those courses injected into computer science curriculums. I have had to learn it sort of on accident, very much on my own, because I learned how much humans matter in cybersecurity. But that was long into my career. But I want to share some of the things that I've learned, inspired in part by this book that I'll tell you a little bit more about at the end, that was co-written with Gene Spafford at Purdue and Lee Metcalf at Carnegie Mellon. So after 19 years in government, I transitioned to an industry role. And my company does applied research. They do commercial consulting. And the through line that I have seen in all of this is people. And that's what I want to share some of those lessons about. So I was traveling a week ago through the Baltimore airport, and some of you I know flew in and probably had a similar experience, which is while I'm standing in line waiting to go through security, a video is playing up on the screen. And the video actually caught my attention because I never pay attention to these things. It's just, here's how to follow the queue, here's how to put your bags through. But this one caught my eye because it was different. It was a man and a woman on the screen. You might have seen this as well. The man is the TSA administrator, that's not a surprise, talking about safety and security at the airport. The woman does not work for TSA. It was the CISA director, Jen Easterly, and Jen was talking about cybersecurity, cyber hygiene. As this captive audience is there, right, waiting to go through physical security, she said, make sure you turn on your backups. Make sure you have MFA enabled. And I thought, well, that's weird. I didn't expect to see that here. But I love CISA. I think they're doing great work. I'm a big fan of cyber hygiene. So all positive things to say about that. But I use that as my introduction to say, what could go wrong? So I believe, and I think others of you have seen this too, that dozens of times, hundreds of times a day, our brains fail us, right? They do us a disservice. They betray us into making decisions that are not what's best for us, and sometimes making decisions that are even dangerous for us sometimes. How many people remember the SolarWinds incident? Show of hands. Lots. This got press attention. Even people who aren't in computing heard about SolarWinds. They might not know what it means or what it does. But the impact and the scale, tens of thousands of victims, government organizations who became victims of this very interesting event, right? Which, as you might have heard, pulled back in the very beginning to a password that allowed people to change the code in the update server. So we've all been trained, right? Jen Easterly was on the screen saying, make sure you update your software. People were doing the right thing, and they got infected. You can do all the right things, and things can still go wrong. So the password to the update server for some amount of time was SolarWinds 123. Some system let a human pick that password. Maybe there was a password policy, maybe there wasn't. And at the time, Microsoft's president said this is the largest, most sophisticated attack we've ever seen. But it started with an easy-to-guess password. And so many things do like that. Now, there are a lot of human aspects to this story, right? There are humans who developed the software and for any number of reasons, it was vulnerable to a sophisticated attack. There were very sophisticated attackers. Supply chain attacks are relatively rare, but they are hugely destructive when they happen. So if you had $1, I don't know that you should spend it on supply chain defenses when you could spend it on MFA, for example. But there are many humans in this story. Unfortunately, the SolarWinds CEO during a congressional hearing blamed the intern and said, literally said, the quote was, a mistake was made that an intern chose. And he walked that back. He apologized, but how often does that happen where we just point, we want to have some throat to choke when something goes wrong, and this was a big bad incident for the company, and the CEO blamed the intern for picking a bad password. I think we all can shake our heads at that, but it did happen. He said it out loud on the record, and there are, I think, a lot of reasons why that story exemplifies the fact that as much as we're all trying, these problems are not better today, arguably, than they have been before. This is a difficult part of computer science, which is, are we safer today than we were yesterday? Difficult thing to measure. I would implore anybody who can get into that topic to get into them. But we still have modern day problems that resemble ones that you and I all know are really, really important. It is my belief, and somebody might disagree with me, that every aspect of cybersecurity is about people. Every single thing. The fact that we have computers is because people use them. They wouldn't exist if there weren't for people. We wouldn't just build tech for its own sake. We build it so that we can do jobs. Cybersecurity is not most people's primary job. My doctor's job is not cybersecurity. It is to provide good medicine, and cybersecurity should be there to help it. And it's not just about end users. I think too many researchers and practitioners believe that the real people we're trying to help, quote unquote, are the people who sit and use the computer, right? The very end of the spectrum. But I want to remind you, there are many more people in this system. There are people who design these computers. They get tired too. There are people who can administer them and set the policies for things like passwords. They make mistakes. And often overlooked are the attackers. The attackers make choices. They have to sleep, they have to eat. They have to decide to attack you or not you. And there's only very recent research trying to understand them and disrupt them as people. But I think that's really interesting. And I will say, I make a lot of assumptions about people in that ecosystem. For example, if my email vendor thought I needed to worry about failed login attempts, well, of course they would tell me, right? If I have Microsoft email and it's been logged into 10 times, they're gonna tell me, aren't they? Like, these are assumptions that we make as people about the stuff that's just provided for us. So every aspect of cybersecurity is about people, but our human brains are optimized for shortcuts and assumptions, sometimes for the good, right? I don't wanna have to spend all my brain power thinking about every aspect of this room, but my brain can filter it out. I will tell you that the book that changed my life was Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. I didn't know the work of Kahneman really before that book. Again, I was trained as a computer scientist. If you ask people at a cocktail party, ask them sometime, what book changed your life? Not what one did you like, but what one caused you to do different things. That book changed the trajectory of my career. I don't know that Kahneman cares or knows that, but it really got me thinking about cybersecurity. That book is not about computers at all, but I read every page thinking, what does this mean for me in computer science? What does this mean for me in cybersecurity? And he taught me a lot. You should read it if you haven't read it. It's very approachable, about how our brains make very quick, fast decisions and how that can both benefit and fail us, and when we should slow down and make careful, slow decisions. The other paper that has always stuck with me is one that I heard a couple of years ago, getting people to slow down before they clicked links in an email, right? That's a dangerous action. And this researcher actually proposed that you couldn't click on the link for 10 seconds. You literally had to wait, like physically slow down before you were allowed to push the button. That would tick me off. I would probably never use that system, but I like the idea of it. How can we make people slow down to make good decisions when they need to? And then the third thing, right, cybersecurity is all about people. Our brains are optimized for slow decision or for quick decisions, but those assumptions lead to bad security. It's not just that it's unfortunate. It actually leads to bad outcomes. And that's a difficult thing to think about, like, so what? I think the SolarWinds example is a pretty clear example of this. The so what about those bad assumptions for the password policies and the update servers was catastrophic for that company, for their reputation, for their stock, for their bottom line, for a CEO who lost his job, but the tens of thousands of victims, right? People made assumptions that if I do patching, I'm going to be fine. If I buy from a trusted vendor, I'm going to be fine. But if we don't appropriately question those assumptions, it does lead to true bad outcomes. So I used an M word in my subtitle here, and I think there are several M words I want to emphasize. And those are misguided, and myth, and misconception. Those are related words. They're all sort of in the same ballpark, but let me tease them apart for you a little bit. When we make decisions that are misguided, that means showing faulty judgment in our reasoning. So we are making a decision based on some bit of information or training or something that happens to be faulty. And that doesn't mean it's intentional. It doesn't mean that you are being maliciously deceived, but we are following a direction of reasoning and thinking that is the wrong one. Myths are widely held beliefs, but are false. And again, they come up from many reasons. And myths and misconceptions, which are just incorrect views based on that faulty thinking, again, related concepts. But if you think about it today as you're sort of walking around and think, well, I heard one time that like it's cold outside and I lose 90% of the heat through my head. Why do you think that, right? That is a very commonly held myth. There is no science behind that, but my mom told it to me and I have told it to other people wrongly, right? We just can't shake that one. And there's lots of those in cybersecurity too, like, oh, I need to change my password every 90 days. Why do you think that? Well, every website I encounter makes me do it, even though NIST changed the guidelines eons ago, but it hasn't propagated to real life. And so people get these myths sort of stuck in their head, and they're really, really hard to shake. And I need your help to help bust them. As you see them, help get them corrected, because I can't tell you all the myths that will ever exist. They're gonna keep coming up. So that's gonna be my call to action for you at the end. So where do they come from? Sometimes they just come from misinformation, right? People's own experiences, interactions with the world, things like, well, I have to change my password every 90 days, so that must be good, right? But they don't question why is that the case. They don't seek out other information. They don't go and read the new NIST guidelines. This is especially bad for developers who implement those systems. Some myths, though, are just based on information that has changed over time. I was a bachelor's student in computer science more than 20 years ago, and some of those things have changed. Some of the things I was taught in school are no longer true. This is why we need continuing education. It's why doctors are required to do it. Computer scientists do it. Sometimes we're not required to, we're not a licensed, regulated profession, but that information does lead to making choices that are now outdated. So they do come from lots of different kinds of places, and squashing them as soon as possible is the direction we need to get to. As I mentioned before in the SolarWinds case, there's this natural human tendency to want to blame someone or hold someone accountable, maybe is the polite way to say this. While that might have a productive side benefit, it doesn't actually solve problems, right? If the CEO just comes and says, well, I blame this person, that doesn't make the problem fixed, and it doesn't make future problems less likely, probably. If people are just afraid to do the right thing, this is my complaint with phishing training, which is done poorly. People just get their hands slapped, right? They just get blamed instead of being helped towards a better outcome. But it makes us feel better. And that's, I think, why it persists. I think it's why it persists not only in cybersecurity, but lots of places. But again, it doesn't solve problems. And this hindsight bias that, well, the user should have known what to do, or I would have done a different thing in that situation. I encourage you not to get sort of sidetracked by that kind of thinking, which is be positive about the situation, solve the problem that is at hand, and prevent the problem from happening without using blame as a weapon. So let's talk about assumptions in cybersecurity a little bit. These come in a lot of forms. Let me give you some example sentence structures. People will fill in the blank. People always fill in the blank. People never, people can't, people won't. All of those sort of sentence structures are built on the premise of assumptions. And those are super dangerous words. Academics know this, that we don't write those words in papers because we can't justify them. And that's why they sort of read wishy-washy to average non-academics. But it's because we're hedging bets, right? Which is, I can't say never. There will always be some exception to that. But let me fill in some of those blanks for you. People will understand the risk of their decision. That's an assumption that I would very strongly caution you to avoid. People will always have a smartphone on them. If a software developer is building a airline tracking system and the only way to check the status of the airplane is to have a cell phone, there are humans in America who don't have smartphones. Not everybody has the latest version of a smartphone. And so developers make this mistake all the time, which is certainly everybody runs Chrome, right? But again, these assumptions about how the world works leads to bad choices and bad outcomes. Some developer might say, people will never need to customize their security settings. I know what's best for them. I will not even expose choices to them. That is an assumption about use cases, how a business might use that technology. Another might be that, well, people can't notice small differences in the design. So I can just keep tweaking the user interface. They're just not going to notice. That is quite an assumption that might break a screen reader. It might break automation systems. So those kind of assumptions, again, seemingly benign, probably made with good intention, but lead to poor outcomes. The last one here, people won't want to disable the microphone. I worked in a government organization a long time, very much wanted to be able to turn microphones off. But that isn't the way that software developer thought, right? They viewed the world as everybody's going to have this thing. They're always going to want it on so that they can do this cool thing that I built without considering what else is out there. So let me talk for a moment about humans and technology. As I've been alluding to, it's easy to think uniformly about big groups. All humans behave in a certain way. All Americans behave in a certain way. All software developers, all users. That's when we start to get into trouble, is ignoring the nuance of the diversity of life. And that gets us into trouble quite a bit. Differences among people's income or access or goals, especially when you start to look at the global scale. We're a little bit, in some ways, homogenous in the United States in that we at least have access to lots of technology, but not everybody has it. And that can lead to really interesting bad choices. I was listening to a podcast, I listened to a lot of podcasts from Planet Money not that long ago, about physical pagers in hospitals. There's this perception that why would you possibly use this 1980s technology in the hospital? And there was a research team that tried to question that assumption and to say, why do they not have smartphones? And I will never forget, in the research study, the smartphones did very well. In fact, they increased the time that doctors could view images and respond to emergencies, and eventually the doctors turned them off. And what they learned was, especially in the emergency department, it was too easy. It was too easy to send a message where with a cell phone, you have to call a number, you have to think about whether the person's going to respond to the page. Maybe it only shows a phone number on that device. The smartphone, in fact, got turned off because it was too noisy. It introduced too many interactions. The friction was too low. And so they went back to pagers. That shocked me. And I think about that a lot in terms of, well, I'm always trying to make technology easier to use. How could that backfire, right? I'm already introducing an assumption that easier is better. But I try to hold myself in check that what possibly could go wrong in that kind of a scenario. Just an interesting sort of anecdote. So let's think for a moment about rational decision making. For those who haven't studied behavioral economics, I don't blame you. That's an interesting field that, again, like psychology, is something I had to acquaint myself with over time. And this is very much about, particularly in product selection, am I making the sort of best choice for me given all of the things that I can possibly know? If you go to the grocery store and you're buying grape jelly, are you comparing the one you're looking at to the benefits, the trade-offs, the pros and cons of every other one on the shelf? That would overwhelm most human brains, and what behavioral economics has found is people don't do that. They don't actually consider all of their choices to make the optimal decision for them at any given time. And this shows up in every scenario of your life. As you think about it today, as we're at happy hour, think about how you're ignoring a lot of other choices that might be better for you because it helps your brain speed up. If you had to think about, well, should I talk to this person or this one? Should I, what are the pros and the cons? How much value would I get from talking to Josiah over Julie? That isn't a useful use of your brain power. And it also shows up in cybersecurity, which is when somebody goes to click on a link or decide whether or not to update their phone, they're not weighing all of the choices, right? They're not thinking about, well, what is the potential loss that will occur if I make choice A? And will I be happier, more beneficial, more well off if I make choice B? That's just the reality. We have to accept that people will not consider all of their choices. There's really interesting work, if you want to look into it, about sort of making choices salient, making them visible and available to you when you need them, so that you can make an informed decision. Because, again, we don't want to assume we know what's best for everybody. Let me say a word about vigilance. This is an area that I read a lot about in cybersecurity for a time, and vigilance very much is about how much focus and attention we need to do a task. Is the user really paying attention to what does this fake email look like? Is it really trying to solicit me? We have to devote vigilance to that kind of task. And end users are the ones who are studied quite extensively about this, but there's other vigilance too. I think about software developers in my new company quite a bit. Is the software developer always thinking about security if their goal is get the product out the door or write another 1,000 lines of code today? How carefully and are they thinking about those individual choices as they make them? Leadership has vigilance problems, whether they're thinking about does security impact the choice that we're making in terms of are we going to adopt Slack or Teams? Are they vigilant to the security part of those kind of conversations, or do they have some other mechanism that somebody in the room who can help remind them? And interesting enough, I keep coming back to attackers because I think this is an interesting topic. Attackers have a vigilance problem too. In fact, the FBI at one point said that the attackers got sloppy in a recent attack. And that might be for our benefit, but it at least highlights that vigilance is something that affects that community as well. So it's not just those end users. What if we aren't all tech savvy? There's been a long line of research papers about the difficulty of using encryption. Johnny can't encrypt, why Johnny still can't encrypt. There's this whole field of papers about the usability of security software, particularly in encryption. My anecdotes are that when I talk to people like my neighbor about encryption, they will click 0 buttons. Like the burden is, if they have to do anything, they won't do it. So if they get it for free and it happens automatically, they might accept that choice, but that isn't how we think, that isn't how me as a PhD computer scientist thinks about how to do encryption. It's, oh, we need to give the users a choice. We need to do all these things. And then we're starting to come into conflict of ideas, right? Which is, I don't want to assume that people won't click any buttons, but I need to gather that information to know that is the barrier for some groups of users. Some groups of users need a lot of control. I wrote a paper with Gene Spafford a while ago about invisible security, which is for some groups of people, they won't click any buttons. They won't click the update button. It just has to happen for them automatically. We caveated, because we're academics, that that isn't true for everybody. Some corporate organizations, right, MITRE, for example, big companies, need control over the update process because it will break stuff. But there is another group of people who will just click nothing, and so that invisible security was our pitch there. So, I've talked about a lot of problems. Let's talk a little bit more positively. So let's talk about getting from sort of myths and misconceptions to being more perceptive and well-informed, which I think is the opposite of misguided. That's what I would say. So one is, how can we consider other factors that haven't been thought about in our own decision-making, especially when it matters a lot in terms of what products we're going to buy, how we're going to engage with the workforce. When that matters a lot, what are we not thinking about? And there are several ways to do that. One that is often brought up in training is bias, right? Just acknowledging that it exists, that we are considering opinions that are not well formed. And one of the things that I've liked, one idea that I've liked is the idea of a decision observer. This is from another Danny Kahneman book that I thought this was a great idea that I've never put into practice. So I don't know how well it works, but I like the concept of it, which is to have somebody in the room who's more or less an outsider, but is watching what is going on, listening to the conversation and saying, you all just spent an hour talking about the technical details of the implementation, but you've forgotten about the people. You've forgotten or you've overlooked these other aspects of the decision that you're trying to make. I think this would be a great thing for us all to try. It's very low cost, right? The next meeting, just invite someone to do that for you and see if it provides some value. I'm all for small experiments. Another thing that I think I have had to learn is that I make a lot of decisions as a cybersecurity professional because I'm not well informed about the people that I'm trying to help. Researchers do this sort of as a natural thing, but I've also learned, I learned at NSA actually, this process of sort of lean startup customer discovery. And this is something that any normal person can do. It isn't something you have to be a PhD in, but customer discovery helps you understand how the real users who are going to adopt a piece of technology, how they act, behave, what their actual real problem is. For people starting businesses, it's a good way to discover, is my product actually a fit for the problem that these people have, and to get feedback. Research community, I think, as we heard earlier, has trouble sometimes talking to real people, talking to the actual end users and consumers of things. Lowering that barrier, I think, would be super helpful. But it is important, and if you have the opportunity to let your workforce participate, it is incredibly valuable to getting better products. Another area that I'm actually quite excited about is threat modeling. This has been going on for about a decade, sort of seriously, about how do we understand what is the attack, what are the methods that a system can be attacked, whether it's email or a building. There are formal methodologies now for how to do this. There are new ones in AI, so that we can look at an AI chatbot, for example, and say, what could go wrong here? How could somebody try and attack this model? But it helps us understand those threats in a way that is realistic. And a third one is to partner with developers insofar as you as an individual, your organization, your people, your students can be a part of that. That does lead to much better outcomes. Yeah, so it's very dim on here, but I wrote a paper about something called the I-Core methodology. This is sort of lean startup for government, and we applied it in cybersecurity at NSA in a way that we couldn't find any resources that had been done before. And if you want to read sort of a short 5-ish page paper about how we did that in cybersecurity, you can check out that link. Okay, a couple of takeaways for different audiences. First, whoever you are, wherever you work, whatever your core day job is, I think it's important to remember that we all have some responsibility for our own security. There's a lot of security built into my car, but it's still incumbent on me to drive it safely. I'm glad it has anti-lock brakes and a seatbelt and traffic laws, but I find this when I talk to people in healthcare, for example, who say, well, I'm using a cloud service that's HIPAA compliant. 2 thumbs up, great, glad you picked that. And you can make a big mistake if you upload patient records that are in that cloud HIPAA compliant storage device that's open to the internet. You have some responsibility to behave correctly. In cybersecurity, you have some responsibility for your own security. And if you don't question your own assumptions, you bear some of that responsibility as well. The second is just to slow down, not necessarily waiting 10 seconds before you click on an email, but I wrote a paper some time ago about action bias in cybersecurity, which is this sort of knee-jerk reaction to just do something, do anything. And in incident response, this bites us sometimes. We just jump to action and make the problem worse without having a plan that we made ahead of time, having practiced the plan like fire drill, and then doing the rational, careful thing during the crisis. But slowing down in important decisions, that matters a lot. And then thirdly, this overgeneralization of all people will do X, or users will never want Y. Those are generalizations. And so being careful with that broad language to be specific and narrow about who you actually mean will help avoid some of the problems that I've talked about. What does this mean if you're an industry? I am excited to see efforts in things like secure by design and other defaults. I don't think they're quite perfect yet. I wrote 2 responses to CIS's secure by design document because I thought this is a good, important thing for us to get towards, but it's not quite there yet. If you have the opportunity, I think actually some training in human factors or psychology would be really useful, even for a general audience. I should have had it long ago. I think it needs to be injected in new and creative ways for people for whom that helps. And then the one that I've talked about before, which is help us measure outcomes. Is security better today than it was yesterday? What mistakes are, what is the consequence of mistakes? Do companies go out of business? Does it cost them a particular amount of money if they make poor choices? That helps emphasize the message. So just to note, you do play a role in busting future myths. All of the things that I've talked about can be avoided, every single one of them, with the kinds of advice that I've given, like slowing down and not overgeneralizing. I love the people in cybersecurity who are building work around mental models, which is how do I even understand what encryption means and how do I make better choices? And those assumptions can actually be part of the design. Peter Lascasso at NSA quite a long time ago wrote a paper. If you can't read that, I'll send it to you, about how assumptions should be tracked in the design process. I like that idea a lot. So some of these ideas were part of a book, as I said, that I wrote with Spaff and Lee. There is 175 things like this in this book. And we wrote it because we kept hearing over and over again, oh, this is how the world works. I will tell you the number 1 myth is that we all agree what the definition of cybersecurity is. That's myth number 1, chapter 1. And we talk a lot about that and what are the consequences of not having a common definition, because that does lead to problems as well. It's not all about humans, but a quarter of the book is sort of human focused. Other ones are about data and AI and forensics and what do we see in the movies. So it's quite a broad book if you're interested in that. And with that, I would like to say thank you and invite any questions.
Thank you, Julie. Really interesting talk.
Hi, Josiah. Fun fact, when Josiah started at NSA, he was an intern in my group. And by the time I left, he was mentoring me. So, yeah, thanks. I did not.
Probably.
We didn't do it to each other. Really interesting talk. I always love to hear your point of view. So you mentioned that you're a big proponent of getting more of these kind of human factors courses, like in the curriculum to get, our future workforce. And you mentioned kind of human factors training. How do we address this at scale? Because I don't know that there's a lot of professional training already available. And I want you to meet Dr. Calvin Nobles back there in the corner because he's a huge proponent, if you don't already know him, of human factors. But I was just wondering your thoughts about how do we kind of reach the existing workforce at scale?
I appreciate the enormity of the ask that I made, and it probably has to be done carefully and strategically. Let's start with the people for whom it is the most impactful. Who in the organization is making decisions about security relevant choices? They are the ones I want to give that information to first, and in a way that they can implement. So in the same way that not everybody understands any training the same way, right? Tailored training now is much more useful than everybody takes the same security awareness training. Plenty of research that shows that isn't ideal either. So I think tailoring it to the audiences who need it at the time they need it in a way that resonates with them, that's probably a great way to start. There is more and more out there, right? There's a SANS course now on human factors. And there are sort of industry blogs that talk about this. So I think it's out there if we make the deliberate effort to push it.
My question is about the assumptions we have about the folks who are taking this training. I think I had another session where I went to, and they were just like, there's research behind it, but they're saying, most people don't like their jobs. They don't like where they are. They don't care to do the best. If the company gets hacked, it's on the company, right? Or like, I didn't do that. Okay. So I guess with that, sure, thank you. So with that in mind, I think I've been working to try to use that knowledge to be helpful and acknowledge that, hey, people don't want to do this already. How do I make this less of a chore, a burden? How do I make it useful and make it less like feeding them kale and more like feeding them chocolate, right? Like, how do you do that?
I wish I had the answer to that. I'd be much more famous if I knew the answer about how to help human motivation, like including getting people to eat healthy and do cyber hygiene. I don't know for sure. I think one of the biggest problems is that we don't feel the pain immediately or intensely to cyber choices that we make, right? Even if my name shows up in a data breach, I don't know what to do differently. And so it's hard for people to quantify that it matters to them in the moment that they're making that decision. Or they think, well, I don't care if my company fails. Some of them probably say that, so I'm just not going to make a careful choice. Those are psychology choices, economics choices, I think, more than how does Josiah change the computer.
So, kind of to, I guess, answer her question and to piggyback a little bit, everyone goes to work because they want to get paid and get money, right? If you tie your performance to cyber hygiene, if you tie your cybersecurity performance to your performance evaluations, which in turn ties to your paycheck, will then create a sense of urgency for everyone to take cybersecurity a little more seriously. That's one. So I am the cybersecurity training person at my agency. And that's one of the things that I've been pushing for, is to make that part of your end of year evaluation, right? How well you do in the efficiency exercises, how well you do in the cyber hygiene, if you've done your cybersecurity awareness training, if you've done your privacy training, if you've done all of these check in the box things that most people don't take seriously, if you tie that to their performance evaluations, people tend to notice a little bit more. Now, stick and carrot, yes. Most folks don't care about, oh, well, no, I checked the boxes, fine. But if you make it relevant to them, oh, this will affect my 3% versus 5%. This will affect my bonus versus not getting a bonus. It's one way to get them to take it more seriously. Is it the best way? I don't know.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. I think there's probably mixed opinions in this room about what approaches are the most fruitful or not. There's a lot of great research. There's a workshop called the Workshop on the Economics of Information Security. Some of you probably know. It's sort of a small workshop where they think about incentives, carrots and sticks. There is not consensus, right? There's certainly disagreement. Smart people disagree.
This is super helpful coming from a technologist perspective. I think words matter. And so the word human factors resonates with technical. It's not a psychology term. It is an engineer's, and people think GUIs. What I really liked actually was your customer discovery, like, because it implies versus end user. So when you say end user, right, technology, software developers, they think I'm an end user. But they're not the end user, right? They're like a super end user. And we've studied this actually for NIST on barriers on how they think and should they be incentivized to do good, because they don't get blamed when software fails usually, the developers. But those kind of words matter. So I thought customer discovery was good. And I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about security and safety. But why isn't it just called safety then? Because humans already know how to do that and they care about that. Why do they have to care about security? What they actually care about is safety of their money, their people, their reputation, whatever that is. Why do we want people to report things? Well, I see something, you're asking me to report, that sounds like a really big deal. But I only saw this thing, I don't know, right? Like, so I think sharing versus reporting, I think those matter a lot. And I think in your talk, you highlight a lot of opportunities to think more carefully on what we call people to do, right? To go do an end user survey versus a customer discovery actually implies something very different and could be really valuable, security versus safety. So I think you highlight lots of things that are in psychology, but the practical way we use that is remembering that what we call stuff really matters on what humans do. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. I think that words do matter. Lawyers aren't the only ones who would echo that, but I would agree with you as well. There is, I'll mention another resource. The Human Factors and Ergonomics Society is an international giant conglomeration of experts. You can get a degree in human factors, but they have an association with themes. And so you can do human factors in cockpit design, and you can do human factors in furniture design. We started one for cybersecurity a couple of years ago. And so people who think about human factors in cybersecurity, practitioners and researchers, present at that event as well, just for people's awareness.
And last question.
I remember vividly, it's been, I don't know, 40 years since I read Cliff Stoll's The Cuckoo Egg.
Right.
And there are a number of lessons from that book that are just written in my mind because he told a wonderfully rich story about a cybersecurity incident and then left the industry. How do we capture those kinds of stories to tell one another and tell those that we're trying to educate? Because a lot of the training and awareness is not very interesting from the storytelling perspective. And who's doing it well in your mind?
I agree that stories do work. The Cuckoo's Egg is probably the first book I give to somebody. I was just talking to a college student who was thinking about getting into cybersecurity. I said, read this book. It's old but relevant. The Cuckoo's Egg by Clifford Stoll. I don't have time to give you the whole story, but we can do it at a break. It is very good. I think there are other stories. I think my more concern now is the sort of glamorization of them to the point where they're not real. So we can tell stories like SolarWinds because it's real. Like, here are the facts, here's why it mattered. There's too much sort of sensationalism, especially the way that like cyber is portrayed in movies, right? We talk in our book about one of the Mission Impossible movies, and it's like, here's 3D code and you can see the hex, and no, that isn't how the real world works at all. Like, I have some concern that we need to be cautious in how we tell stories. I do think it resonates. I do think it helps when done appropriately.
Cuckoo's Egg is also a PBS show about it.
Great.
Great book.
Thank you very much, Josiah.
Thank you.